The high-stakes G20 summit has begun and leaders from around the world are in Bali to discuss and debate the most pressing contemporary issues. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is also attending in the summit. He made remarks at the first session on food and energy security, where Prime Minister Modi said that the ongoing supply chain crisis has triggered serious concerns for poor citizens in every nation who are struggling to make ends meet. He also said that the world has failed to make appropriate reforms for the vulnerable, and that is where a bloc like G20 comes into play. Prime Minister Modi reiterated India's stance of diplomacy being the only way out of the Ukraine conflict. He also highlighted the need for energy security, saying that the world should not be prompting energy restrictions and stability should return to the market. Prime Minister Modi underlined India's commitment to green energy, noting that New Delhi aims to generate half its electricity needs from renewable sources by 2030. Now joining us from the ground is our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal. He's joining us from Bali. Siddhant, we are being told that the first session is currently underway. How is the mood there? And we are also hearing so many inputs by Narendra Modi. Can you tell us and get us up to speed on that?
Well, the summit started almost 2 hours ago, and we have seen the initial opening statement by the Indonesian president. He mentioning about the war and of course saying that it should come to an end. But now of course it's a closed door session, but statements are out when it comes to other leaders who have been speaking. The Indian Prime Minister of course spoke about highlighting 3 key points. First on the supply chain disruption, the second on diplomatically resolving the Ukraine conflict, and thirdly, and perhaps the most important part, is in the backdrop of the Western calls of putting a cap on Russian energy. He has said that there should not be any such restriction. That's a key point the Indian Prime Minister has made during his first intervention in the first session of the G20 summit that has started here in Bali.
Now, to give us more insight, we're also being joined by Ambassador Anil Wadhwa. He has closely worked with the External Affairs Ministry of India. Now, Mr. Wadhwa, as India looks to take over the presidency for next year, what is New Delhi eyeing at this year?
So, this is actually India's moment for the G20, and as a leading country in the global south, it has already made its intentions clear to steer together the agenda for the global south and for the developing world and emerging markets. A glimpse of that we got when Prime Minister Modi spoke today about supply chain disruptions, but also India would look for a reform of the international institutions, especially in the field of economics, so that the primary role of the G20 as a body which can regulate and which can modulate policies towards the economics which govern the world for the good of the global south can be put forward. And for that, India is ideally placed because it has proved itself. It's a proven country with a track record of digital transformation, the efforts it's made towards energy transition and towards climate change. And this is what India will look for to transmit through the G20 presidency.
Absolutely. Now, Siddhant, I want to go back to you. Now, visuals have come in of Prime Minister Modi sitting beside President Biden. We also saw a brief chat between the two leaders. Is it too early to read between the lines, or can this be seen as a positive sign?
Well, it certainly is.
Well, for sure, the informal nature of the relationship between the two leaders, we know that similar shots were seen when the Indian Prime Minister visited Germany earlier this year, when the US President had gone towards him and exchanged greetings with him. And this time again we have seen those visuals, but this time here in Bali. In fact, we saw the visual of the French President Emmanuel Macron as well, who came and patted the back of the Indian Prime Minister before going forward and having conversation with the American President. But largely these sessions, these meetings, the G20 summit, the G7 summit, the SCO summit, provide ample of opportunity for world leaders to be in the same room and, of course, exchange greetings and have those informal conversations that can lead to policy changes as well. Now, we know that amidst the COVID pandemic, there were virtual summits, including the G20 meeting virtually under the Saudi Arabian presidency. These virtual summits are good. There are conversations, but these conversations, the visuals we saw, are difficult to happen. And that is why many are happy that the fact that the G20 summit is back in person, meeting for the second time in a row in person after the Italy summit last year.
Absolutely, Siddhant. I'm afraid we will have to let you go, but of course we will keep coming back to you for all the inputs. Ambassador Wadhwa, please stay on with me. I want to discuss something in particular. Now, Russia's invasion has definitely united the West, but it has also created a divide between the West and the developing nations. There is a sort of a pressure when it comes to sanctions and restrictions against Russia. Now, India has been able to ward it off, but how do you think other countries will do in this G20?
So I think the pressure is there on the developing world much more than anyone else, especially as far as food prices and energy prices are concerned, the lack of fertilizer, the supply chain disruptions, etc., which have happened all over the world. Earlier, we also saw a shipping crisis which emerged, which has fortunately been resolved to some extent at the current moment. But it is always the developing countries which feel the brunt of policies which are undertaken without taking into consideration the fallout which it will have on those who are more vulnerable and who are poorer than the rest. Now, we've seen in the current situation that the West has already cornered the gas supplies from most of the sources which are available. That has resulted in high gas prices all over the world. And right now, there is a move to cap the price of oil as well, regulate the oil markets, which will further have an impact on the developing world. And this is precisely what India and Prime Minister Modi have pointed out, that the interests of the developing countries have to be taken into account when any such policy decisions are to be taken.
Absolutely. Now, you know, this year's summit has an uncanny resemblance with 2014's. Like, Russia had annexed Crimea in February, and exactly 8 months later, the G20 summit happened. What is different this year is that Vladimir Putin attended that year's summit, and he has decided to skip this one. In fact, he was welcomed by fellow leaders that year in 2014, and this time we are being seen like the global world is kind of shunning Russia for the invasion. I want to ask you, what do you think changed in these 8 years?
Well, it's the circumstances and the extent of this particular conflict, because we've seen enormous amount of destruction which has taken place in the past few months as far as Ukraine is concerned. Everyone knows that it will take a lot of effort to rebuild Ukraine going forward. And the other issue is that was a limited war, comparatively speaking, where the after effects were not felt to this extent because it didn't last for such a long time. But in this case, the prolonged conflict has left a lot of effects on countries which are the most vulnerable. Of course, his presence would have meant that the G20 would have not talked about the issues at hand, but would have concentrated on talking about what's happening in Ukraine. So in a sense, he did realize perhaps himself that this was the best way to go about it, sending Foreign Minister Lavrov to take care of the business at hand at G20. And I think there's a sigh of relief, in fact, that has actually happened. Despite this, I don't see, that the communique, which normally comes out of the G20 meetings, will have such a smooth passage, because the diplomats are still haggling over the wording over how to treat Ukraine and Russia in this particular communique. It'll be a miracle if that comes about and everybody agrees. Otherwise, we'll probably have a president's statement.
All right, Ambassador Wadhwa, thank you for all your insights.